beyond the boundaries of reality, where imagination weaves dreams into existence. Welcome to Storylight. Elena stood at the edge of the forest. The tall, ancient trees looming like silent sentinels before her. The wind rustled the leaves in a soft, rhythmic whisper. But there was something different about today. The forest felt as though it was watching her, waiting for something. The townspeople had always spoken of the ancient magic lingered, a place where few dared to venture. It was said that those who entered the grove never returned. Or if they did, they were never quite the same. But today, Elena had no choice. The village was in danger. The crops were failing, and strange illnesses had begun to plague the people. Desperation had led the village elders to send her, the youngest of the village's children, into the heart of the forest to find the heart of the magic that had once kept the land fertile and alive. If anyone could find it, it would be her. Her grandmother had spoken of the grove often, telling stories of the old magic that ran through the trees. "There is a way, child," her grandmother had said, her voice trembling with age. "If the balance is broken, you must restore it. The forest remembers." The forest. Elena took a deep breath and stepped into the shadows of the first row of trees. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, moss, and something, but not in a pleasant way. There was an undercurrent of rot, like the scent of something long forgotten. The further she ventured, the quieter it became. The usual chirps and calls of birds and insects were absent, and even the wind seemed reluctant to pass through the thick canopy of leaves above her. But there was something more. Soft and indistinct, seemed to follow her, wrapping itself around her like a thread of sound that refused to be ignored. It was a voice, or many voices, murmuring in unison. Elena couldn't make out the words, but the tone was haunting. Elena. Her name. It came from all around her, but no one was there. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, and her heart pounded as she pressed forward. "I must be hearing things," she muttered to herself, though her voice sounded oddly muffled, as though swallowed by the forest. The further she walked, the more the whispers grew louder, as though the forest was aware of her every step. The trees around her seemed to close in, their gnarled roots twisting like fingers reaching out to grab her. "Elena, do not go deeper," the whisper echoed again, this time clearer. She froze. The voice was soft, yet like a warning. But there was no turning back now. She had come too far, and she could feel that something important was close. It had to be real. "Please," Elena whispered into the quiet forest. "I need to find it." A rustle from the underbrush snapped her out of her thoughts. She spun around, but there was nothing. Only the ancient trees, their twisted branches creaking in the wind. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw something, like a shadow darting between the trees. Elena's pulse quickened. She wasn't alone. Something was following her. The shadows moved with an unnatural speed. And for a moment, Elena wasn't sure if they were real or if her mind was playing tricks on her. But the whispers had stopped now, replaced by an eerie silence that hung over the forest like a thick fog. "Who's there?" Elena called out, her voice louder now. She took a step forward, trying to locate the source of the movement, but nothing answered. Then she saw it again, a shadow darting across the trees. This time, Elena chased after it, her curiosity overpowering her fear. Her heart hammered in her chest, and her footsteps felt heavy on the soft forest floor. The deeper she went, the more oppressive the silence became. The forest was as if anticipating something. Suddenly, the shadow stopped. Elena came to a halt, staring at the figure ahead of her. It was tall and ethereal, with long, silver hair that flowed like liquid moonlight. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes glowed with an unnatural green light. She was dressed in a flowing gown made of leaves and vines, her presence. "You shouldn't be here, child," the woman said, her voice like the rustling of leaves, soft but commanding. Elena's eyes widened. "I'm looking for the source of the magic that keeps the land alive. Please, I need to find it." The woman tilted her head, as if considering Elena's words. "You seek the source, but do you understand the price?" Quote. Elena nodded, her hands trembling. "The village needs help. The crops are dying, and people are sick. I have no choice. The elders have sent you because you are," the woman interrupted. "But there is more at stake here than you know. The source is no longer what it once was." "What do you mean?" Elena asked, stepping closer, her voice filled with desperation. The woman's gaze turned sorrowful. "The source was once Elena's heart sank. She had heard stories of the forest's ancient magic, of the great forces that held the land together. But she hadn't realized how much had been lost over time. "But what do I do? How do I save the village?" Quote. The woman studied her for a long time, her eyes filled with an unfathomable sadness. Finally, she spoke. "The source can still be reached. But it will take more than just courage. You must. There. You will find the answer. But know this. The path will not be easy. The forest will test you. And the consequences of failure are dire." The woman's words hung in the air as Elena stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. The woman had disappeared into the shadows, leaving Elena alone at the edge of the forest's deepest depths. Her pulse quickened, and her mind raced. It had to be the source of the ancient power. It was the only place where she could hope to find an answer to save her village. With a deep breath, Elena stepped forward, determined to find the heart. She walked for what felt like hours, the forest growing darker and more twisted with each step. The trees seemed to close in around her, their branches forming walls, their roots rising like serpents from the ground. The forest was alive, and it was watching her. The first trial came without warning. As Elena rounded a bend, she found herself standing in front of the ground split wide, as if torn by some ancient force. On the other side, the path continued, but the chasm seemed too wide to cross. Through the gap, its cries almost like voices calling her to leap into the abyss. Elena swallowed hard. She had no choice but to cross. She stepped back, then ran toward the edge, launching herself across the gap. Her heart raced as she sailed through the air, her fingers brushing the edge of the opposite cliff as she landed, feet skidding on the uneven surface. She barely made it but managed to regain her balance, her breath ragged in her chest. She had passed the first test, but what awaited her next? Elena continued her journey, pushing forward despite the uncertainty that gripped her. Every step seemed to draw her deeper into the unknown, the air thick with magic and an unsettling silence. The trees, their branches twisted like ancient hands, seemed to stretch higher and higher as she moved forward, almost as if they were guiding her towards something. As she walked, the forest began to shift. The path, once clear, now twisted and turned in confusing directions. The ground beneath her feet became uneven, the soil soft and treacherous. Elena felt the weight of the forest closing in on her, its pressure rising with each passing moment. The whispers from earlier returned, but now they were louder, more distinct. She could almost make out words, though they seemed foreign, alien in nature. "Elena, beware." The voice was faint, but there was no mistaking it. The forest was trying to warn her, or perhaps, guide her. Who is there? She called out, her voice trembling as it echoed through the dense trees. There was no response, only the soft rustling of the leaves as if the forest itself was listening. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows, tall and cloaked in a robe made of woven vines and bark. The figure's face was hidden beneath a hood, but the voice that followed was deep and resonant, echoing through the grove. Who seeks the heart of the forest? The figure asked. Elena stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never seen anything like this before. No one had ever spoken of the forest guardians. I am Elena, she said, her voice trembling. I seek the source to save my village. The figure's hooded face tilted as if considering her words. You seek the source, but you are not prepared. The heart of the forest does not offer its power freely. What do you mean? Elena asked, her voice shaking. I have to try. The people I love are depending on me. The figure stepped forward, its presence almost overwhelming. The source does not come without sacrifice, child. It will demand if you are not worthy. Elena swallowed hard, the weight of the guardian's words pressing down on her. Was she ready for this? Was she willing to give up everything for the sake of her village? I don't have a choice, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I must do this. The figure studied her for a moment, its piercing gaze seeming to read her very thoughts. Then, with a slow nod, it stepped aside. Then you must face the trials of the grove. You must prove your worth before the source will grant you its power. Elena stepped forward, the path now opening up before her. The trees parted slightly, revealing a vast clearing bathed in an ethereal light. At the center of the clearing stood an ancient stone altar, covered in moss and vines, its surface inscribed with cryptic runes. The guardian's voice echoed again. The first trial is the trial of the mind. Only those with a pure heart and clear mind can pass. You will face visions of your deepest fears, your greatest regrets. If you falter, you will be lost. Elena nodded, steeling herself. She had no choice but to face whatever came her way. She stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the altar. And the moment she did, the world around her shifted. The trees dissolved, replaced by a vision of her childhood home. The air was heavy with smoke, and the sky was dark with swirling clouds. Her parents were there, their faces twisted in terror as the house burned down around them. No, Elena cried out, rushing toward them, but her feet wouldn't move. The fire raged, consuming everything in its path. Her mother's screams pierced the air as her father tried to shield her. But the flames overtook them both. Elena, her mother's voice cried out one last time, a cry filled with pain and sorrow. Elena felt her heart break, her body trembling as she watched the horror unfold. The memories of that day, the day her parents died, came rushing back in a tidal wave of grief. It had been her fault. She had been the one who started the fire when she was a child. It was a mistake, an accident, but the guilt had never left her. Please, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. I couldn't save them. I couldn't save anyone. The vision flickered, and suddenly, she was back in the clearing, standing in front of the stone altar. The burning house was gone, but the weight of the guilt still lingered, heavy in her chest. You are not ready, a voice said, deep and cold. It was the voice of her father, distant and full of sorrow. You failed us, Elena. You failed everyone. Elena fell to her knees, her hands shaking as she pressed them to her face. She couldn't breathe. The shame of that day, the day she lost everything, was too much to bear. She had failed. She had failed them all. But then, something shifted. A small, quiet voice inside her spoke. You didn't mean it. You didn't want this. It was an accident. Elena's tears slowed, her body trembling less. I didn't mean to, she whispered. The vision began to fade, and the voice of her father grew distant. You must forgive yourself, Elena, or you will never be able to move forward. Elena took a deep breath, wiping away the tears that stained her cheeks. The guilt would always be with her, but she had to let it go. She had to move forward. For the village, for her family. The clearing around her began to shift. The trees returning. And the altar once again stood before her. She had passed the first trial. But there were more ahead. The next trial was the trial of the heart, the guardian's voice said. Elena stood on the edge of a vast, swirling lake. The water so clear it reflected the sky like a mirror. The guardian's words echoed around her. To pass the trial, you must face your deepest desires. The temptation will be strong. And only by resisting it will you prove your strength. The water shimmered, and suddenly, Elena saw something. On the other side of the lake, across the mist, stood the figures of her parents. They were alive, smiling, as if they had never perished in the fire. Come to us, Elena, her mother's voice called, sweet and loving. We've waited for you. The temptation was overwhelming. Elena's heart raced. And she felt the overwhelming urge to run to them. To join them and forget the trials. But she knew, deep down, that it wasn't real. She clenched her fists. Taking a deep breath, the vision wavered. And her parents' forms began to dissolve into mist. Elena knew that to save her village, and herself, she had to resist. I love you, but I can't follow you, she whispered. I have to save them. Elena crossed the lake. Her heart heavy, but resolute. The trial of the heart had been difficult. But she had overcome it. Now, ahead of her, stood the last challenge. The trial of the soul. The air around her grew colder, the very atmosphere thick with an unfamiliar energy. The guardian's voice echoed once again. But this time, it was different. There was a strange resonance. A weight to the words. You have passed the trials of mind and heart, Elena. But now, you must face your soul. To claim the source, you must surrender all that you are. Your fears, your desires, and your very essence. Elena felt her chest tighten. What do you mean? She asked, her voice barely audible in the stillness. I have already lost so much. What more can I give? Quote. The air around her shimmered, and the ground beneath her feet began to tremble. The trees parted once more, revealing a vast cavern at the base of a mountain. The entrance glowed with a soft, ethereal light, almost as if calling her inside. There was no turning back now. With one final glance at the guardian, Elena stepped forward, her heart heavy but filled with determination. She passed through the glowing entrance, her eyes adjusting to the dim light inside. The cavern was silent except for the soft echo of her footsteps. It was vast, stretching out in all directions. In the center of the cavern stood a crystalline pedestal, bathed in an otherworldly light. And upon the pedestal, the source itself, glowing with an intense energy, pulsing like the heart of the world. Elena approached slowly, drawn to it by some force she could not explain. The closer she got, the more the air seemed to vibrate, resonating with her very being. She could feel its power, its pull, as if it was calling to her very soul. As she reached out to touch the source, her vision blurred. Suddenly, the cavern faded, and she was back in her village. The sounds of laughter and warmth filled her ears. Her family was alive again. Her mother, her father, everything was as it should have been. She could feel the warmth of their embrace, the love they had once shared. Elena, her mother said, her voice soft and comforting. "You've done it. You've saved us. You've saved everyone." Elena's heart swelled with joy. She had succeeded. She had brought them back. But as she looked down, she saw something unsettling. Her hands began to fade, her body becoming translucent. She tried to call out, but no sound came from her lips. The warmth of her family, the joy she had once known, was slipping away. It was all just a fleeting illusion, a vision of what could never be. "No," Elena whispered, panic rising in her chest. "No, please." The world around her began to unravel, her family dissolving into mist. She reached out, desperate to hold on to them. But the more she tried, the more they slipped away, until she was alone in the vast, empty void. "You must choose, Elena," a voice echoed from the darkness. It was the voice of the Guardian, but now it sounded distant, cold. "The Source grants great power, but it demands a great price. Your soul will be consumed if you do not release your desire for what you cannot have." Tears streamed down Elena's face as she realized the truth. The Source could give her what she wanted, but it would come at the cost of everything she had fought for. If she accepted the power, she would lose herself. Her soul would be consumed, and she would become no more than a shadow, lost in the darkness. "Is it worth it?" the voice asked. Elena closed her eyes, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. For a moment, she thought of her village, of the people who needed her. She thought of the sacrifices she had made, the pain she had endured. But above all, she thought of the truth that had been hidden in the grove. Power came with a price, and she could not afford to pay it. She stepped away from the pedestal, her hands trembling, but steady. The light that had been so blinding dimmed, and the Source remained still, silent, as if it were waiting for her to return. "I cannot," Elena whispered, her voice full of sorrow. "I choose to keep my soul. I choose to protect those I love, even if it means losing the power of the Source." The cavern fell silent. And then, slowly, the air began to shift, as if the very fabric of the world was bending. The Guardian appeared before her once more, his form now radiant with the light of the Source. "You have made the right choice, Elena," the Guardian said, his voice full of quiet reverence. "The Source will not be claimed by those who seek it for selfish gain. You have chosen the path of sacrifice, and that is the true strength." Elena looked up, her heart swelling with emotion. She had made the right decision, but it had not been easy. There was no turning back from the path she had chosen. But she knew now that it was the only way. The Guardian extended his hand to her, his face solemn. "Your village will be saved. The balance of the grove has been restored. But you will never forget this journey, Elena. You will carry its weight for the rest of your life." Elena nodded, knowing that this was the price she had paid. But she had no regrets. She had made her choice, and now, it was time to return home. The journey back through the grove was easier, though the weight of the trials lingered in her heart. Elena had passed the tests, and with the power of the Source still lingering in the air, she knew that her village would be saved. But she could not shake the feeling of loss that gnawed at her. She had seen the truth of the Source, and she understood now that not all power should be sought after. Not all sacrifices were worth it. The real strength lay not in wielding power, but in knowing when to let it go. As Elena emerged from the forest, the familiar sight of her village greeted her. The streets were calm, the people going about their daily routines, unaware of the dangers that had threatened them. And yet, Elena could feel a sense of peace in the air. Something had changed. Something had shifted, and the balance had been restored. The villagers gathered around her as she returned, their faces full of hope and expectation. They were safe. The danger had passed. Elena stood tall, her heart filled with quiet resolve. She had made it through the trials. And now, her true journey, her true purpose, was only just beginning. The story ends here. But countless others await in the vast expanse of imagination. Subscribe to Storylight for more journeys into the unknown. See you on the next adventure.